1 second later, 2 seconds later, 3 seconds later, 4 seconds later, 5 seconds later, 6 seconds later, 7 seconds later, 8 seconds later, 9 seconds later, 10 seconds later, 11 seconds later, 12 seconds later, 13 seconds later, 14 seconds later, 15 seconds later, 16 seconds later, 17 seconds later, 18 seconds later, 19 seconds later, 20 seconds later, 21 seconds later, 22 seconds later, 23 seconds later, 24 seconds later, 25 seconds later, 26 seconds later, 27 seconds later, 28 seconds later, 29 seconds later, 30 seconds later, 31 seconds later, 32 seconds later, 33 seconds later, 34 seconds later, 35 seconds later, 36 seconds later, 37 seconds later, 38 seconds later, 49 seconds later, 40 seconds later, 41 seconds later, 42 seconds later, 43 seconds later, 44 seconds later, 45 seconds later, 46 seconds later, 47 seconds later, 48 seconds later, 49 seconds later, 50 seconds later, 51 seconds later, 52 seconds later, 53 seconds later, 54 seconds later, 55 seconds later, 56 seconds later, so 57 seconds later, 58 seconds later, 59 seconds later, a few seconds later, several seconds later, a few moments later, several moments later, 1 minute later, 2 minutes later, 3 minutes later, 4 minutes later, 5 minutes later, 6 minutes later, 7 minutes later, 8 minutes later, 9 minutes later, 10 minutes later, 11 minutes later, 12 minutes later, 13 minutes later, 14 minutes later, 15 minutes later, 16 minutes later, 1,000 seconds later, 17 minutes later, 18 minutes later, 19 minutes later, 20 minutes later, 21 minutes later, 22 minutes later, 23 minutes later, 24 minutes later, 25 minutes later, 26 minutes later, 27 minutes later, 28 minutes later, 29 minutes later, 30 minutes later, 31 minutes later, 32 minutes later, 33 minutes later, 34 minutes later, 35 minutes later, 36 minutes later, 37 minutes later, 38 minutes later, 39 minutes later, 40 minutes later, 41 minutes later, 42 minutes later, 43 minutes later, 44 minutes later, 45 minutes later, 46, 47 minutes later, 48 minutes later, 49 minutes later, 50 minutes later, 51 minutes later, 52 minutes later, 53 minutes later, 54 minutes later, 55 minutes later, 56 minutes later, 57 minutes later, 58 minutes later, 59 minutes later, a few hours later, a few minutes later, several minutes later, an hour later, 1 hour later, 2 hours later, 3 hours later, 4 hours later, 5 hours later, 6 hours later, 7 hours later, 8 hours later, 9 hours later, 10 hours later, 11 hours later, to 12 hours later, a half day later, 30 days, 30 now. 13 hours later, 14 hours later, 15 hours later, 16 hours later, 17 hours later, 18 hours later, 18 hours later, 20 hours later, 21 hours later, 22 hours later, 23 hours later, a few hours later, the most one I use, I guess, several hours later, 24 hours later, 2 days later, 3 days later, 4 days later, 5 days later, 6 days later, a few days later, several days later, 1 week later, 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, 4 weeks later, a few weeks, a few weeks later, several weeks later, 1 month later, 2 months later, 3 months later, 4 months later, 5 months later, 6 months later, 7 months later, 8 months later, 9 months later, 10 months later, 11 months later, 12 months later, a few months later. I guess that it's several months later. 1 year later, 2 years later, 3 years later, 4 years, 4 years later, 5 years later, 6 years later, 7 years later, 8 years later, 9 years later, a few years later, several years later, 1 decade later, 2 decades later, 3 decades later, 4 decades later, 5 decades later, 6 decades later, 7 decades later, 8 decades later, 9 decades later, 99 years later. A few decades later, 1 century later, 2 centuries later, 3 centuries later, 4 centuries later, 5 centuries later, 6 centuries later, 7 centuries later, 8 centuries later, 9 centuries later, several centuries later, or a few centuries later, 1 millennium later, 2 millennium later, 3 millenniums later, 4 millenniums later, 5 millenniums later, 6 millenniums later, 7 millenniums later, 8 millenniums later, 9 millenniums later, and a few other things larger than a millennium shall be. 1 a.m., 2 a.m., at 3 a.m., at 1 a.m., at 2 a.m., at 4 a.m., at 5 a.m., at 6 a.m., at 7 a.m., at 8 a.m., at 9 a.m., at 10 a.m., at 11 a.m., at 12 a.m., at 13 a.m., at 14 a.m., at 15 a.m., at 16 a.m., at 17 a.m., at 18 a.m., at 19 a.m., at 20 a.m., at 21 a.m., at 22 a.m., at 23 a.m., at 24:00 a.m.,